Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, back to another installment of the Campfire Storytelling Podcast. For all things Halloween, this is hauntformer, and it's a sad time of year. The Halloween season is over, and we're moving into the holidays, which leads us to Thanksgiving. A time to be thankful. I'm so thankful for each and every one of you, and I appreciate the kind regards and remarks for this new series. This is going to be episode 6, and as I talked about in some of the previous installments, you don't have to see those as predecessors to this, or precursors, I should say. But as I mentioned in those previous installments, I didn't merely want to review movies through this podcast. I wanted to talk about the genre of horror as a whole, and how it changes, how it's evolving, and I really think that 2 movies from 2022 do a fantastic job of describing the changes that I think are occurring in the horror genre as it continues, as it has since its very inception, to change. Those 2 movies, and yes, I will be, somewhat reviewing them here, but largely to talk about my point. But the 2 movies I want to talk about are, first, Barbarian, which you've probably heard of by this point. This movie was released in September, and it has had a great bit of word of mouth, and I will be discussing my thoughts on it, which, let me just say, are very positive. I really enjoyed the film. And secondly, more fresh, because I just watched this film tonight as I'm recording this, the eve of Thanksgiving Eve, The Menu, which may very well be my favorite movie of the year. Now, I don't want to quickly jump to that, because I don't want to sound like, oh my gosh, I don't want to overhype it. I just want you to go in and enjoy the film, but I will say I really enjoyed it. This film, The Menu, along with The Black Phone, probably will comprise my favorite movies of the year. I love the blend of horror and comedy on display here, and the same can really ring true for Barbarian, and this leads to something I want to discuss that has to do with the genre as a whole. And I've noticed this trend maybe more so recently because we've seen a shift in the tonality of these horror films. And here's what I mean. A lot of the most successful and most acclaimed recent horror films have been those that a lot of people have described as elevated horror. You've probably heard this term. If not, you may have been enlightened about it in the most recent Scream movie. They actually kind of jab at elevated horror. Elevated horror is, in essence, horror that has a lot of substance and style to it. The horror genre, I feel like, has always had these types of movies, but, of course, there are a lot of schlocky movies that always seem to slip into the genre. I guess a good example of an elevated horror film of the past may be something like The Shining or The Exorcist, Rosemary's Baby. These more thoughtful, thought-provoking, atmospheric type of horror films. And more recently, we've seen this with movies from A24, movies like Hereditary, Midsummer, The Witch, The Lighthouse. A lot of movies, yes, from Ari Aster and other directors that have really, proven their craft quite well. But I have noticed a gradual shift from this very self-serious kind of horror to integrate more of the silliness. I think one huge advocate for this is Jordan Peele, who is able to pull off really well executed, quote-unquote, elevated horror, while also being able to add lighthearted moments of fun, quippy character stuff, and humor. in addition to a little dose of schlock. And in this kind of episode, I want to talk about this very trend, integrating elevated horror, quote unquote, and schlock. Because there has been a good chunk of horror films, there have been a lot of movies this year that have done this very thing. Bodies, Bodies, Bodies is one, Smile is another, even to an extent Nope. Now, I haven't seen Pearl and I haven't seen X, but I have heard very positive reviews of these movies, and it seems like they're maybe not taking themselves super seriously. And that is kind of one of the flaws, I guess, or the criticisms, at least from my perspective, of these very elevated horror films. Not to say that I dislike them. I do think there are some that are a bit overrated. Was not a big fan of Midsommar, whatever. I really loved Hereditary. I also really loved The Witch. And there have been these movies that have popped up, and I've really liked them. I haven't seen Men yet. But there are these movies that seem to be more so serious than they are trying to be funny. And it does raise the question, where does art and entertainment separate? And where do we draw the line in the sand as to this movie is boring, it has a lot to say, and it's very artful and tasteful, but it's kind of just blowing smoke, and it kind of, is up its own butt, so to speak, a little too much, versus a movie like maybe Annabelle Comes Home, any of these jump scare type of horror movies that are not trying to preach, not trying to do anything else but entertain and offer some kind of, escapism, if you will. To me, the best type of horror integrates the two. They have lighthearted moments, they offer something quirky or interesting, they keep the entertainment or the energy up, but they also do it in a very creative, very artful, and meaningful way, with moments that have meaning. Again, I go back to these old classic horror movies, but again, you take a movie like The Shining, which has a lot of substance to it, a lot of layers. There's an entire documentary about The Shining and breaking it apart. The same goes for The Exorcist. But really, aside from being these very deep movies, they're also some of my favorite horror films of all time. They're also incredibly entertaining to watch, with great performances, great lines, interesting storytelling, great atmosphere. You need both ends of the spectrum. And what I am pleased to report, at least from my personal opinion, is that amalgamation, that blend of entertainment and also the tastefulness and the art is making a comeback. And that was most prevalent to me in Barbarian and The Menu. Because if you broke down the tasteful, artful, quote-unquote, aesthetic or whatever you want to call it, the palatable substance of the movie, Barbarian is a movie about kind of the Me Too movement, and about harassment, sexual harassment in the workplace, and about who do you trust when it comes to these issues, and just beyond in terms of trusting people. And The Menu is about love for art and experience, and how ultimately that can be stripped away over a grueling lifetime. And I say that, and it sounds very tasteful, it sounds very poetic, but at the end of the day, both of these movies do have a good amount of schlock. And I'm trying to beat around the bush because, for one, The Menu is a very recent movie, and I don't want to spoil it at all. But also, Barbarian's only a month or two old, and I really recommend you see it without any precursor. So if you really don't want to be spoiled at all for these movies, I highly recommend you pause this video, watch Barbarian, watch The Menu. I recommend both of them highly, and then come back and we can have a discussion here. But in order for me to explain what I mean, I really need you to see those two films. Barbarian follows a young woman that shows up at a rental property, an Airbnb, if you will, which reminded me a lot of The Rental, which actually came out last summer. And it's already booked by a stranger, a man that she does not know, played very well by Bill Skarsgård, and in the trailer, he's kind of this red herring type figure. He's very sketchy, but he makes great amends to show that he's not this way. And what that does is make you question it even more. Like, okay, he's really trying to prove he's not sketchy, but that almost makes it more sketchy. And you kind of start with this very mundane premise. Likewise, in The Menu, you follow a group of kind of yuppie, snobbish people as they show up at this very fancy, exclusive restaurant on this remote island. And there's this world-renowned, acclaimed chef, kind of like a Gordon Ramsay type character, who runs this restaurant, runs this kitchen, and horror ensues out of that yuppiness, so to speak. The music in The Menu is done by Colin Stetson, who you may know from Hereditary. And likewise, there are producers of both of these movies that have come from pretty significant backgrounds. So on the front, both of these films seem like very prestigious type horror movies, one of them dealing with more of like a sexual harassment kind of, disturbing angle, and The Menu coming from this very mysterious kind of yuppie angle. And then you start watching them, and you get into them, and you realize that they both have a great tongue in their cheek. They have a great sense of humor. Barbarian, which starts as this very thoughtful, kind of provoking, atmospheric movie, turns into a movie about this giant monster mutant woman with saggy boobs chasing people through corridors. And The Menu turns into killer chefs in this restaurant that, there are goofy gags and jokes throughout it. I was likewise at the same time both incredibly horrified and gripped with suspense on the edge of my seat and laughing out loud for both of these movies. And you sit there and you watch them and you're scared one minute, you're laughing the next. And it reminds me so much of the great horror comedies of the past that nail both the comedy and the horror. A great example of this is, of course, one of my favorite classics, An American Werewolf in London, which one minute you have a werewolf mauling young people to death, like ripping their skin and their clothes apart, people screaming and fleeing for their lives, and it's grueling and it's terrifying. And then the next minute, you have a naked young man running through the park in London with balloons around his genitals, like something out of a National Lampoon skit. And it's so funny. But the scene you just watched was so horrific. And it's that great blend of the horror and comedy that works so well. And I don't just mean that these mix of schlock and elevated elements means that it just throws jokes or comedy in it. But it's the tongue-in-cheek nature of the movie, and it's not taking itself too seriously. It's maybe why a movie like Bodies, Bodies, Bodies is more tolerable than Don't Worry, Darling, which took itself extremely seriously and had a lackluster script. It's perhaps why, even though I didn't love the movie, why a movie like Smile is so positively received. You have a message about guilt and about PTSD, but at the same time you have creepy smiles and monsters climbing inside people's bodies. It mixes what the public wants to see, the fun, interesting horror elements that harken back to that 70s and 80s style, while still having something to say and done so in a tasteful way. And both Barbarian and The Menu exemplify these elements really, really well. And aside from just, a well-written script, which both Barbarian and The Menu have, they also are acted really well. The music selections are really good. And the editing is really important to making these work. You're watching Barbarian, and it gets to this really heavy part where they discover this monster, under this house. And you're just turned for a loop because you were thinking Bill Skarsgård is this evil guy torturing people under the house. There's like a creepy camera and like a sex dungeon kind of place. It's really quite disturbing. Then you see this giant boob old lady monster, and then it just hard cuts to Justin Long driving down the street, in California, and you're thrown for a loop. Likewise, in The Menu, you have these interesting and maybe inevitable scene transitions that show the names of dishes, and they range in terms of their absurdity, with some of them just being simply what they are, to others being straight-up jokes in and of themselves. You even have actors delivering lines that are complete farce. There's a scene where Anna Taylor-Joy and Ralph Fiennes, I think his name is, who is, played Lord Voldemort in the Harry Potter movies, very serious, very character-driven actors. And their line, I kid you not, is, "A cheeseburger. A cheeseburger? A cheeseburger." Like, it's completely goofy. Yet, it's done almost so seriously that you can't help but smile and enjoy the ride. And it goes to show that these movies had a sense of humor, they didn't take themselves too seriously, and they went with it. And I think that's what makes these movies so much fresher than some of these movies that have a stick up their butt and really are very overly preachy. And again, like I said with movies like Get Out or even Nope, Us, it goes back to that Jordan Peele way of saying something really deep. Like you take Get Out, and it's a movie about racism and class, yet at the same time, it's a really interesting horror movie, a really great thriller, and an intriguing mystery with fun characters. Of course, you have the Rod character, who was the TSA agent. A lot of great laughs with him, but at the same time, you get really in depth with this really important social commentary, but the commentary never outweighs the movie. The movie isn't the message, the movie is a movie with a message. And that's what I've always appreciated by those classic movies that are able to tell important societal lessons without taking themselves too seriously. You think of a movie like They Live, the John Carpenter 80s movie, that talks about all kinds of stuff, elitism, and the class breakdown, and the media, and the police, and religion. There's so many things that this movie targets, and subliminal advertising. Yet at the same time, it's got Roddy Piper shooting a shotgun at an alien in a bank, and saying, I'm here to chew bubblegum and kick ass. It's absurdity, yet it has very thoughtful moments. Because if you just had this very thought-provoking movie without any of the fun, people would not remember the thought-provoking moments as well as they did. But because you added levity, because you added fun, intriguing moments, that's what makes it stick. That's what makes it land. Versus some of these other very preachy movies that go over people's heads, beat a horse without offering any kind of entertainment value, and it's really quite sad to see. I think a good example is a movie like The Night House. I really wanted to like The Night House. At first I thought, wow, this is going to be the movie of the year, like the sleeper hit. It didn't stick the landing to me. It had some deep things it was trying to say about grief and trauma, but the movie was very serious, didn't take itself... it took itself a little bit too seriously. It had the atmosphere. I also think it had to do with the script that was a little confusing. But it had the atmosphere, it had the storyline, but it fumbled with the tonality of it, and that's really sad. And that's why some of the most popular horror movies ever are usually the ones that are playful. You think of movies like Killer Clowns from Outer Space, Nightmare on Elm Street. These movies are so iconic, they never took themselves that seriously. They had a fun time. And horror has always been a genre to push that weirdness factor. And movies like Barbarian and The Menu are certainly weird. They certainly subvert what you think is going to happen. As someone who dives into and loves storytelling, and loves writing, screenwriting, and also just narrative, fiction, when I watch movies, I see the movie, and then on the side, in my head, I see the script as the movie goes. So, like, when the character walks in my head, I'm thinking, Daryl walks in the room, he closes the door, and, sits at the table. Daryl, dialogue, blah, 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 blah. How are you doing today, Bethany? Whatever. It doesn't matter. That's how I see movies. And I usually can predict, very quickly in my head. I don't want to do this, I should say. This is just how my brain works. Because I I love critiquing movies and assessing movies. That's why I'm, blabbling on right now. But you take that, and I kind of can see the 3-act structure. I can see, okay, where might this character arc go? Where will, A lead to B lead to C in terms of this plot? But watching both of these films, I genuinely was not sure of what to expect. At first, in both of these movies, I'm like, okay, Barbarian, Bill Skarsgård's probably going to be a creep. There's going to be some stuff going down. He's lying to her. Was wrong about that. The Menu, I'm like, okay, maybe this chef is like cannibal, or they're eating people, and they're going to, be hoity-toity about it. Was wrong about that too. And it's the freshness of that, the uniqueness of that, the way it offered something different to me that I really appreciated. A lot of people are saying that, there's so many remakes, there's so many sequels to franchises. And while I don't necessarily hate some of them do get a bit annoying, I will admit, seeing, there's another Jeepers Creepers movie out, I mean, as much as I, have come to enjoy Halloween Ends, it is like the 13th Halloween movie. There's a new Scream, blah, 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 blah. They're constantly pumping out remakes of movies. They've been talking about remaking, so many classics that I'm like, please don't touch that movie. They're remaking The Exorcist next year. So people have gotten tired of these, rinse and repeat type of movies. But for every one of those, there are movies like Barbarian and The Menu, among others, that really shine, that really add something unique. Again, I recommend both of the movies very highly. If you'd like to see me do individual reviews more in depth about each of these films, I'd be glad to talk about them. Again, Barbarian was one of the best horror movies I've seen this year, and The Menu might have been my favorite movie of the year. I am a big advocate for horror comedies, and so The Menu really hit a sweet spot with me. Not to say Barbarian didn't, but The Menu hit it maybe more so than Barbarian, for my palate, at least. I also like movies that are very condensed. I think the Saw method is important, or the Twilight Zone method, which is keep minimal characters, keep minimal locations, and, really both of these movies did just that. And what was also intriguing to me is, in my estimation, comedy is my second favorite genre after horror, and there have been very few comedies these days in theaters that have managed to pull in people and be funny. Comedy has done pretty well on the small screen, on television, but it's really weak in movie theaters. I don't know what there's like that She's All That. There are like a lot of rom-com movies, and I really don't care for those. I love the classic comedies. I love the dry comedies. Monty Python stuff, Airplane, the vacation movies. I mean, a lot of times around this time of year, I can't talk. During this time of year, a lot of people really watch Christmas Vacation. You watch that movie and you realize how smart the humor is. There's some goofy stuff in it, just like all of those movies, because, humor comes down to the absurd. But it's well crafted, it's well written, it's paced very well, the timing is accurate, because horror and comedy are both about timing. But you watch a movie like Christmas Vacation, you go, that's funny because it's relatable, it works, the timing's great, the acting's great. I felt the same way about The Menu. The comedy landed. I thought this movie was more funny than any comedy I've seen in the last several years, yet it also had me on the edge of my seat, biting my fingernails because some scenes were so darn intense and sickening and great. So, it was strange, it was absurd, it was weird, in the best way possible. So, at the end of the day, my closing thoughts are, check out Barbarian, check out The Menu. If you are an advocate as I am for mixing the quote-unquote elevated elements of horror with schlock, with comedy, with these goofy elements and the weirdness that I think really brought horror into the limelight in the 1970s and the 1980s, you will get a kick out of these movies, and I think we can expect more of these style of movies to come. That's going to be it. I know this is a little bit of a shorter podcast, only less than half an hour, but I didn't want to keep beating the same horse in saying the same kind of point, but my point stands. I am interested to hear what you have to say about these two films. Again, I can do in-depth reviews, and you will see at the end of this year my top horror movies for 2022, where The Menu will be included. I will definitely shout out Barbarian if it's not in the top 5, which it very well could be. I have to assess all of the other movies this year, because there have been a lot. You know, Halloween Ends and Scream, Mr. Harrigan's Phone, Hellraiser, you know, I'm trying to think. There have been a lot of movies. I guess I could mention Texas Chainsaw, but that would be probably one of the worst I've seen this year. I guess I could do a podcast on the bad movies too, because for every good one, there's some bad ones. But yeah, that's my wrap-up of my thoughts. Thank you for listening to my rant. I hope you found some insight into my thoughts here, and I will see you in the next installment of Campfire Storytelling. Thank you for listening, ladies and gentlemen, and remember, for all things Halloween, this is Hauntformer.